The courtroom was silent, a suffocating tension filling the air like the moment before a thunderstorm. The wood-paneled walls, the towering bookshelves, the cold metal of the judge's bench, everything seemed frozen in time. The air conditioning hummed softly, but no one noticed. All eyes were locked on a single figure, the officer. A man in uniform. A man who carried authority, who believed himself untouchable, who had spent his career walking with a badge pinned to his chest and a superiority complex swelling inside him like an overinflated balloon. He stood there, his jaw clenched, his fists tight, a storm brewing in his narrowed eyes. He wasn't listening. He wasn't interested in the law. He had already made up his mind about the man standing before him. He saw a black man. And to him, that meant one thing: weakness. And then it happened. A sharp movement, fast as a viper striking, a fist cutting through the tense air like a blade. The crack of knuckles against skin echoed through the chamber, a sound so visceral, so raw, that the entire room collectively gasped. Papers shuffled, a chair screeched against the floor, someone let out a choked cry of disbelief. The force of the blow sent the man stumbling back, his balance breaking for just a second, his lip split open, a thin stream of blood trailing down his chin. His expression barely flickered, but inside there was a fire, burning, raging, screaming for justice. But the officer? The officer stood taller. His chest swelled with satisfaction. He had done it. He had put him in his place. In front of everyone. And the best part? He thought he could get away with it. The courtroom was still spinning in shock when the murmurs started, hushed, hurried, disbelief pouring from the lips of jurors, attorneys, reporters, and onlookers alike. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. A uniformed officer, a white man, had just punched another man, not a defendant, not a suspect, but the judge. The man presiding over this very court. The highest authority in the room. And the officer had done it with no hesitation, no fear of consequence, because in his mind, a black man in power meant nothing. He thought his badge gave him immunity. He thought his whiteness gave him protection. He thought his position made him untouchable. He was wrong. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, the weight of what had just transpired pressing down on everyone like a lead blanket. And then, a voice, low, controlled, but vibrating with a quiet fury that sent chills down the spines of those who heard it. You just made the worst mistake of your life. The words weren't shouted. They weren't spit out in blind rage. No, they were spoken with a precision that made them cut even deeper. They hung in the air, heavy, loaded, carrying the weight of generations of injustice, of humiliation, of battles fought in silence. The officer blinked, his smirk faltering for just a moment, as if realizing, too late, that something had shifted. That the power dynamic had flipped. That the man he had just struck wasn't going to shrink back, wasn't going to let this go, wasn't going to be just another victim in his long history of unchecked brutality. Because this wasn't the streets. This wasn't a dark alley with no cameras, no witnesses, no consequences. This was a courtroom. And the man standing before him, blood still fresh on his chin, was the law. A shift in the atmosphere, a tension in the officer's shoulders, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. For the first time, he felt it. The weight of his mistake. The realization that this wasn't going to end the way he thought it would. That this wasn't going to be another one of those stories where the system would shield him, where his badge would protect him, where he would walk away laughing while the man he humiliated was left picking up the pieces. No. This time, it was different. Because justice wasn't just going to be served. It was going to be delivered. The courtroom doors swung open, heavy boots against the floor, authoritative voices cutting through the lingering shock. Movement, fast and deliberate. Someone was walking forward. Someone with power. Someone with consequences. The officer's hands twitched. His pulse pounded in his ears. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control. What happened next left the entire room in stunned silence. Because what the judge did in response wasn't just a reaction. It was a reckoning. Hey there, family. Before we dive into today's story, I want to take a moment to speak directly to you. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in any form. This channel is a space where powerful narratives expose the truth, uplift those who have been silenced, and remind the world that justice is not just a word, it's a right. If you've ever felt underestimated, overlooked, or disrespected because of the color of your skin, know this: you are seen. You are valued. You are powerful. Now, sit back and get ready for a story that will shake you to the core. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Plow of Twist so you never miss a tale of justice served. Enjoy the story. The weight of the gavel in his hand always reminded Judge Malcolm Hayes of the responsibility he carried. It wasn't just a tool for order, it was a symbol. A symbol of justice, of authority, of the years of sacrifice and struggle that had led him to this very moment. At 46, Malcolm had seen the system from both sides. He had grown up in the South Side of Chicago, where the law wasn't always a protector but often a weapon wielded against people who looked like him. His father, a man of quiet dignity, had worked tirelessly as a public defender, fighting against the crushing machine of systemic racism that swallowed black men whole and spat them out in prison jumpsuits. His mother, a schoolteacher, had instilled in him the belief that education was the one thing they could never take from him. And he had taken that lesson to heart, pouring everything he had into books, into studying, into climbing out of the cycle that had trapped so many before him. Malcolm had worked his way through law school, taking shifts at a diner, barely scraping by, enduring the dismissive glances of professors who doubted him and classmates who saw him as an anomaly rather than an equal. But he had persisted. And when he finally donned that black robe for the first time, when he took his seat behind the bench, he had promised himself one thing: he would be the kind of judge his father would have been proud of. The kind who saw people, not just case numbers. The kind who understood that justice wasn't about punishment, it was about balance. But balance was hard to maintain in a system that wasn't designed for men like him to sit in power. He had made enemies. There were whispers, murmurs behind closed doors, resentment bubbling beneath polite handshakes and thin smiles. Some attorneys refused to look him in the eye. Others tested him, prodded at his authority, waiting for him to slip. But the police officers? They were the worst. They didn't respect him. They saw his robe as a joke, his position as a mistake, something that had slipped through the cracks of their world, a world where people like him weren't meant to wield power over them. And none of them hated him more than Officer Darren Callaway. Darren was the kind of cop who had joined the force not to protect, not to serve, but to dominate. A third-generation police officer, he had been raised in a household where power meant everything, where respect was measured by fear. His grandfather had been a legend on the force, a hard-nosed detective who had never hesitated to keep order in ways that never made it to the official reports. His father had followed the same path, and Darren? He had inherited that same belief, that the badge made him untouchable. That his word was law, even when it wasn't written in any statute. For years, he had patrolled the streets with impunity, racking up complaints that never went anywhere, incidents that were brushed under the rug by his superiors. He knew how to play the game, how to frame things just right so that every use of force looked justified, how to ensure that witnesses suddenly didn't remember what they had seen. He was the kind of cop people crossed the street to avoid, the kind who saw himself as judge, jury, and executioner. And Malcolm? Malcolm was a problem. From the moment Darren had stepped into Malcolm's courtroom, he had known this judge was different. He wasn't intimidated, wasn't eager to accommodate, didn't look at Darren like the other judges did, with quiet, complicit approval. No, Malcolm challenged him. He scrutinized his reports, called him out on inconsistencies, refused to rubber stamp his arrests, dismissed cases where Darren's behavior had been questionable. Darren hated him for it. Hated the way Malcolm held him accountable, the way he made him feel small, the way he stripped away the power Darren had wielded so effortlessly over others for years. And today? Today was the final straw. The courtroom was packed. A case that should have been routine had turned into a spectacle. Darren had been involved in the arrest of a young black man, 18 years old, a straight-A student, on his way home from his part-time job when Darren had stopped him. A simple stop and frisk had escalated into an altercation, and Darren had done what he always did, he had used force. The boy had been left with a broken nose, bruised ribs, a concussion. And Darren? He had written his report in the same way he always did. Resisted arrest. Threatened the officer. Necessary use of force applied. But this time, the evidence told a different story. Security footage from a nearby store had captured everything. The boy hadn't resisted. He hadn't threatened. He had complied. The only threat he had posed was existing in the wrong place at the wrong time, in front of the wrong cop. And now, Malcolm sat at the bench, watching Darren stand in front of him, his expression unreadable, his fingers steepled as he listened to the closing arguments. Darren's jaw was clenched so tight it looked like it might shatter. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him, could hear the whispers, could feel his control slipping. He had never been in this position before. On trial, not just in the legal sense, but in the eyes of the public. Malcolm's voice was steady, measured, but the words hit like a hammer. There are no exceptions to the law, Officer Callaway. You may wear a badge, but it does not place you above the justice system. And in this courtroom, you are not the enforcer. You are not in control. Here, the law is what stands above all. Darren's vision blurred. His pulse pounded in his ears. He could feel the walls closing in, the shift in power, the fact that this black judge, this man he had no respect for, this man he had spent years belittling in his mind, was deciding his fate. It made his blood boil. And then it happened. He snapped. In a single, explosive motion, Darren moved. His fist swung before he even registered the action, his rage driving him forward, his need to regain dominance overwhelming every ounce of logic. The impact was brutal, bone against bone, a force that sent Malcolm back in his chair, a sickening crack filling the silence of the courtroom. The gasps were immediate. Stunned. Disbelieving. And for a second, just a second, Darren felt powerful again. But then Malcolm straightened. Slowly. Deliberately. Blood trailing from his lip, his eyes locking onto Darren's with a gaze so sharp, so deadly calm, that Darren felt something he had never felt before in his life. Fear. The air in the courtroom changed. The whispers turned to silence. Every single person in that room was holding their breath, waiting. Watching. Because Malcolm wasn't just going to let this go. Darren had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The entire courtroom stood frozen in time. The echoes of the impact still hung thick in the air, like the aftermath of a bomb detonating in slow motion. The force of Darren's fist against Malcolm's face had been violent, raw, and deliberate. It hadn't been a lapse in judgment. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. A choice made with conviction, with the entitlement of a man who had spent his life believing himself above consequence. Malcolm tasted iron, the sharp sting of blood pooling at the corner of his mouth. His body had absorbed the blow, but his pride, his authority, those remained intact. He let the pain settle, let the weight of the moment carve itself into the air, let Darren feel the silence pressing down on him, suffocating, undeniable. The officer stood there, his chest rising and falling, his jaw clenched tight, waiting for something, anything, that would let him reclaim control. But then Malcolm moved. He didn't react with rage, didn't lash out, didn't stumble back in shock like Darren had undoubtedly expected. Instead, he straightened. Slowly. Methodically. His fingers wiped the blood from his lip, his jaw tensing as he finally lifted his gaze, locking eyes with the man who had just assaulted a sitting judge in his own courtroom. And in that instant, something changed. A shift, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't Malcolm who had lost control, it was Darren. The officer took a step back. The realization of what he had just done flickered in his eyes for the first time. He had spent his entire life exerting power over others, dictating the terms of engagement, ensuring that he was always the one holding the cards. But now he stood in a room full of witnesses, in a court of law, having just committed a crime so blatant, so undeniable, that even his badge wouldn't be enough to shield him. A voice shattered the silence. "Did you just?" It was the prosecutor, his words laced with disbelief, his face twisted in shock. Across the courtroom, gasps turned into murmurs, murmurs into a chaotic crescendo of disbelief. The stenographer had dropped her hands from the keys, frozen mid-documentation. The jury sat in stunned silence. Even the bailiffs, men and women who had been tasked with enforcing order, looked uncertain. Because this wasn't just a breach of decorum. This wasn't just another officer overstepping his authority. This was an attack on the law itself. Malcolm's voice, when it finally came, was quiet but unwavering. "Officer Callaway, did you just strike me?" Darren's fingers twitched, the weight of every eye in the room bearing down on him. His voice faltered, uncertainty creeping in. But then he squared his shoulders, the instinct to defend himself kicking in like second nature. "I was provoked." "You were provoked?" Malcolm repeated, the word curling in the air like smoke. He took a single step forward, closing the space between them. "You believe that being held accountable is provocation?" Darren's lips parted, but no words came. He wasn't used to this, to being questioned, to being challenged in a way that actually mattered. Malcolm could see it in his eyes, the battle waging within him, the desperate search for an escape. He was drowning, and for the first time in his life, no one was throwing him a rope. "Your Honor," the defense attorney stammered, stepping forward, his face pale, sweat forming at his temple. This was clearly a misunderstanding. Tensions were high. "Officer Callaway," Malcolm turned sharply, his gaze cutting through the weak attempt at deflection. "Are you attempting to justify an officer of the law physically assaulting a judge in his own courtroom?" The attorney's mouth opened and closed, like a man grasping at air, before he fell silent. Darren's breathing was heavy now, his shoulders squared in defiance but his eyes betraying him. His whole life, he had lived by a code. His authority was never questioned. His actions were always justified. The system had always protected him. But this time, Malcolm was the system. And he wasn't going to let this go. "Officer Callaway," Malcolm said, his voice carrying through the chamber with the weight of a gavel striking wood, "consider this my final warning. You are standing in my courtroom, in front of every witness present. You have exactly one opportunity to do the right thing before I make sure this moment is the beginning of your downfall." Darren's face burned, the room closing in around him. He could feel it, the power shift, the weight of real consequence settling in. His instincts screamed at him to regain control, to throw up the walls that had always protected him, to dismiss, to intimidate, to bend the narrative to his will. But for the first time, those walls weren't enough. Because Malcolm wasn't backing down. His fists clenched at his sides. His body was ready for a fight. But there was no fight to be had. Not here. Not anymore. And then, the door swung open. A voice rang out. Firm. Commanding. "Officer Callaway, step away from the bench." Darren's breath caught in his throat as he turned to see them, his own colleagues. Two officers stepping forward, their faces unreadable, their movements precise. But they weren't moving to defend him. They were moving toward him. For the first time in his life, Darren Callaway was not the man with power. He was the man under suspicion. Malcolm didn't move. Didn't blink. didn't give Darren even a second of reprieve. The entire courtroom was waiting, watching, the tension pressing down like a storm on the verge of breaking. The officer's breath was coming faster now, his mind racing, searching for a way out. But there was no way out. Not this time. And as he stood there, caught between the weight of his own actions and the man he had so carelessly tried to destroy, the truth finally settled over him. He was about to lose everything. And the worst part? It hadn't even begun yet. The weight of what had just transpired was suffocating. The once lively courtroom, filled with the murmurs of attorneys, the rustling of papers, the tapping of shoes against the polished wooden floor, had been plunged into an unbearable silence. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, that pressed down on the chest like an unseen force, making every single person in that room hyper-aware of what they had just witnessed. The echoes of the impact still lingered in the air, a reminder that something had happened that should have never happened, something that had changed the course of this trial, of this courtroom, of this very system in ways that could not be undone. Darren Callaway stood there, his body rigid, his fingers twitching at his sides, his mind racing, yet somehow utterly blank at the same time. His breathing was uneven, his chest rising and falling with a sharpness that betrayed his outward display of control. He could feel it, the shift. It was like standing on a fault line moments before the earth cracked open beneath your feet. It was in the way the jury sat motionless, their eyes wide, their mouths slightly open, disbelief plastered across their faces. It was in the way the bailiffs, the very men he had worked alongside, the very men who had once nodded at him in hallways with unspoken solidarity, now stood still, waiting, watching, as if they themselves were unsure what would happen next. It was in the way the prosecutor had turned completely pale, his fingers still gripping the edge of the desk as though he needed something to hold on to, something to ground himself in the absurdity of this moment. It was in the way Malcolm Hayes sat, unmoving, unshaken, unbroken. Darren had spent his life believing in his own invincibility. It had been ingrained in him since childhood, passed down like an inheritance, reinforced by every slap on the back from his father, every approving nod from his superiors, every moment in which his authority had gone unchallenged. He had built his entire existence on the foundation that he was the law, that his badge was not just a symbol but a shield, a weapon, a pass that allowed him to maneuver through life unchecked. He had used it. Wielded it. Exploited it. And it had always worked. Until today. Because today, he had made the mistake of thinking that power was absolute, that no one could strip it from him, that he could walk into any room, even a courtroom, and dictate the rules. And now. Now he stood on the other side of it. Now he was the one being looked at like a criminal. The same feeling he had forced upon so many others, the same weight of scrutiny, the same helplessness, was now suffocating him. Malcolm wiped the blood from his lip, slow and deliberate, as if to make sure the image of it, a judge bleeding from the hands of a cop, was burned into the minds of everyone present. His movements were methodical, calm, precise, not rushed, not shaken, not weakened in the slightest. Darren had expected rage, had expected shouting, had expected the kind of emotional outburst that he could twist, that he could manipulate, that he could use as a means to regain control. But Malcolm gave him nothing. No reaction. No anger. No fear. Just a look, a piercing, knowing, unyielding look that said more than words ever could. Darren felt it like a physical thing, a pressure against his chest, a slow, cold realization creeping in. Officer Callaway, Malcolm's voice cut through the thick silence, steady and unwavering, the kind of voice that commanded a room without ever needing to be raised. You have exactly one opportunity to recognize the gravity of what you've just done before I make sure this moment is the beginning of your downfall. The words landed like hammer blows. Darren's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. His entire body burned with the kind of rage he couldn't even fully explain, rage at the situation, rage at himself, rage at the fact that, for the first time in his life, he was losing. And Malcolm knew it. Everyone knew it. It was in the way their eyes pierced through him, in the way even his own attorney had gone still, his face ashen, his fingers now nervously adjusting his tie as if he too understood that there was no way out of this. The bailiffs took a step closer. His own people. His own brothers in blue. Darren's breath caught in his throat at the sight of them approaching, not to back him up, not to clean up his mess, not to twist the narrative in his favor, but to remove him. He had seen it happen before, but never to one of them. And certainly never to him. The betrayal in that realization was almost as suffocating as the shame settling into his gut. His attorney, as if sensing the finality of the situation, finally spoke. "Your Honor," he stammered, his voice barely steady, "perhaps we can." Malcolm's gaze snapped to him, cold and cutting. "Counselor," he said, voice firm but unbothered, "are you suggesting that we simply overlook the fact that your client just committed an assault on a sitting judge in open court?" The attorney visibly swallowed. He knew. He knew the weight of those words. The reality of it. There was no covering this up. No spinning it. No fixing it. This wasn't some back alley, some late-night patrol where the only witnesses were the ones too afraid to speak. This was a courtroom. A public trial. And Darren had just punched a judge. Darren could hear his own pulse pounding in his ears, the rush of blood drowning out everything else, making the room feel too small, too hot, too suffocating. His mind raced, grasping at straws, anything that could undo what had just happened. But there was nothing. Nothing except the truth. The truth that he had finally crossed a line that couldn't be erased, couldn't be swept away, couldn't be handled quietly behind closed doors. The truth that for the first time in his life, he was going to face consequences. The officer standing to his left took another step forward. His voice was firm, professional, the same voice Darren had used so many times before when dealing with hostile suspects. "Officer Callaway, step outside." Darren's entire body locked up. He couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The words felt foreign, surreal. They were for him. They were meant for him. He could feel every eye in the room piercing through him, waiting to see what he would do. Would he fight it? Would he resist? Would he lash out one last time just to prove that he still had some power left? But then he saw Malcolm. Saw the quiet, unyielding certainty in his eyes. And that was when Darren knew. He had already lost. The last bit of control slipped through his fingers as he stepped back, barely able to force the word out of his mouth. "Fine." It didn't sound like him. It didn't sound like him at all. The courtroom watched in utter silence as he turned stiffly, moving toward the officers, each step feeling heavier than the last. He had spent years watching others take this very same walk. But this time, it was him. This time, it was different. And as the doors closed behind him, sealing the moment forever in the memories of everyone who had been there to witness it, one truth remained. Darren Callaway had spent his life believing he was untouchable. But justice had finally caught up to him. The hallway outside the courtroom felt colder than it should have. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, their artificial glow casting sharp shadows along the polished floors. The sound of Darren's boots hitting the tile was rhythmic, steady, but the weight behind each step was heavier than it had ever been. His body moved forward, but his mind was stuck, looping over the last few moments in the courtroom, over the stunned silence, the unshaken resolve in Malcolm's eyes, the quiet understanding that his life was no longer his to control. The two officers walking beside him weren't speaking, their postures rigid, professional. They weren't shoving him, weren't forcing him forward, not yet. But Darren could feel the tension in the air, the weight of unspoken words pressing against his skin like a suffocating force. This was new for them, too. How many times had these same men walked beside him, had stood shoulder to shoulder with him as he exercised his authority? How many times had they looked to him for commands, followed his lead, nodded along as he made sure things went his way? But now? Now they wouldn't even meet his eyes. A sharp breath escaped him, frustration bubbling beneath the surface, threatening to burst through the thin layer of composure he had left. His hands curled into fists at his sides, his muscles stiff, his pulse still hammering in his ears. The need to say something, to do something, to take back control burned inside him, but every possible escape felt like grasping at smoke. He wasn't used to this, to power being stripped from him. They turned a corner, the courtroom now out of sight, and Darren could feel the weight of what was coming next tightening around his chest. Then, a voice. Low. Calm. Unshaken. Do you understand what just happened to you, Officer Callaway? Malcolm. Darren stiffened, his jaw clenching so hard he could feel the tension radiating down his neck. He hadn't even heard the judge step into the hallway behind him. The man moved differently, carried himself with a presence that didn't need to be loud to be felt. Darren kept walking, his mind screaming at him to keep his mouth shut, to not engage, but the question, that damn question, cut through him in a way he hadn't expected. He didn't answer. Malcolm took another step forward, his voice unwavering. I asked you a question. Darren exhaled sharply through his nose, his fingers flexing before clenching into fists again. I heard you. And yet you didn't answer. Darren finally stopped walking. His breathing was deep, measured, forced into some semblance of control. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Malcolm's with something just short of defiance. What do you want me to say, huh? That I made a mistake? That I should apologize? That I regret it? His voice was tight, thick with something between anger and humiliation. Because I don't. You wanted to humiliate me, and you got what you wanted. Malcolm studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with the same quiet authority that had unnerved Darren from the moment they first crossed paths, he spoke. You think this is about humiliation? He took a step closer, the gap between them shrinking, but not in a way that was aggressive, in a way that forced Darren to really see him. You think this is about making you feel small? Darren scoffed, the sound bitter, sharp. That's exactly what this is. You've been waiting for this moment, haven't you? Ever since I stepped into your courtroom. You wanted to put me in my place. Malcolm shook his head slowly, his expression never shifting. No, Callaway. You did that to yourself. Darren's jaw tightened. Don't, you did, Malcolm interrupted, his voice cutting through Darren's rising frustration like a knife through fabric. The moment you let your anger control you, the moment you believed your badge made you untouchable, the moment you hit me, you wrote the end of your own story. He paused, letting the words settle, letting them press into Darren like the weight of a closing door. And now you have to live with it. Darren's breath was heavy now, his chest rising and falling faster, his fists still clenched at his sides. You have no idea what it's like, he muttered, shaking his head. You sit up there, behind that bench, looking down at people like me, acting like you know what we go through. His voice cracked slightly, just for a second, before he swallowed it down. You think you're better than me? Malcolm's expression didn't change. No, he said simply. I think I made different choices than you. Darren let out a harsh breath, his frustration boiling over. You don't get it, he hissed. You never will. You don't know what it's like to have to control every situation, to know that the second you let your guard down, someone's gonna take what's yours. His fingers flexed at his sides, his body tight with pent-up rage, confusion, fear. I did what I had to do. Every damn time. Malcolm held his gaze, steady, unwavering. No, Callaway, he said, voice low, even, sharp. You did what you chose to do. And now, you're going to face what comes with it. A bitter laugh escaped Darren's lips, but it was hollow, humorless, desperate. You think you've won, huh? He shook his head, his chest tightening. You think this makes you the better man? Malcolm didn't move. Didn't flinch. No, he said, and there was something so final, so damning in the way he said it. This makes me the man who's still standing. The words cut deeper than Darren expected, slicing through the layers of justification, of entitlement, of self-righteousness that had kept him from seeing what was really happening. For the first time, he felt it, not just the anger, but the fear. Because Malcolm was right. This wasn't about a single moment. This was about every moment before it, every unchecked action, every abuse of power, every time he had walked away without a second thought, believing himself untouchable. And now? Now the world wasn't looking away. Now, there were no excuses left. Now, the reckoning had come. The officers beside him shifted. The sound of metal clicking cut through the tension. And Darren Callaway, for the first time in his life, felt what it was like to stand on the other side. Powerless. Helpless. Answering for his own crimes. And as the cold steel of the handcuffs locked around his wrists, as Malcolm Hayes watched in silence, Darren finally understood. This wasn't the end of Malcolm's story. It was the end of his. The weight of the handcuffs around Darren Callaway's wrists felt heavier than he ever could have imagined. The cold metal dug into his skin, a foreign, humiliating sensation that sent a violent shudder through his body. The officers beside him moved with the same detached professionalism he had once prided himself on, their grip firm but not cruel, their expressions blank but not indifferent. It was a stark contrast to how Darren himself had treated men in this very position, men whose wrists he had bound with the same restraints, men he had shoved forward with impatience, with dominance, with the absolute certainty that they belonged there and he did not. But now, the balance had shifted. Now, he was the one being led away. The hallway stretched before him like an endless corridor, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting long shadows on the floor. He had walked these halls 1,000 times, had stood outside of courtrooms, had nodded to colleagues, had exchanged knowing glances with fellow officers as suspects were dragged past him, their futures already sealed. But this time, those same colleagues didn't return his gaze. Some refused to look at him altogether, while others stole quick, uneasy glances before turning away, as if the mere sight of him had become uncomfortable, a reminder of how quickly the untouchable could fall. His breathing was tight, his chest constricted. He wanted to fight back, to do something, to say something, to claw his way back to the position he had always held, the one of power, of control, of unquestioned authority. But for the first time, he had nothing to leverage. There were no falsified reports that could explain this away, no department heads willing to cover for him, no comrades whispering reassurances that they'd handle it behind closed doors. There was only this. The reality. The reckoning. The doors to the back corridor of the courthouse swung open, and the stale air hit him like a slap. The outside world awaited, and with it, something worse than the humiliation of the cuffs, worse than the loss of control. Exposure. Visibility. Accountability. He had spent years ensuring that men like him were shielded from the public eye, that their wrongdoings were handled quietly, discreetly, behind heavy wooden doors where consequences were nothing more than whispered warnings. But this? This was different. The media had already swarmed. Cameras flashed in rapid succession, journalists pressed forward, voices overlapping in a frantic attempt to capture the downfall of a man who had once been one of them. Officer Callaway, do you have anything to say about your actions in the courtroom today? Do you regret striking Judge Hayes? Is this the end of your career? The questions flew at him like bullets, each one sharper than the last, each one carrying an accusation he could no longer deflect, no longer twist into a version of the truth that suited him. He opened his mouth, the instinct to control the narrative kicking in, but no words came. Because what could he say? That he had lost his temper. That he had believed, for even a second, that he could get away with it. That he had never considered, not once, that a black judge could actually be the one to bring him down. His silence only fueled the chaos. He could hear the murmurs of people watching from the courthouse steps, some in disbelief, others in quiet, restrained satisfaction. And among them, standing at the top of the stairs, Malcolm Hayes watched. Not with gloating. Not with triumph, but with the unwavering gaze of a man who had seen this ending long before Darren had. Malcolm's presence was commanding without effort, his hands tucked into the pockets of his robe, his posture straight but not stiff, his expression unreadable. He wasn't reveling in this moment. He wasn't smirking, wasn't feeding off Darren's downfall. No, he was simply witnessing it. Watching, as Darren was forced to confront the consequences of the life he had built, the choices he had made, the moment he had finally pushed too far. Darren's breath was unsteady, his jaw tight. He wanted to look away, wanted to escape the scrutiny, the weight of judgment in Malcolm's eyes. But he couldn't. Because deep down, buried beneath the layers of anger, denial, entitlement, there was something else. Recognition. This wasn't just about one moment. This was about a lifetime of unchecked power, of actions never questioned, of abuses never answered for. And now, here he was, with every camera flashing, with every eye watching, with no way out. The officers led him toward the transport van, and as the metal doors loomed before him, Darren felt a sharp, undeniable dread settle in his chest. This was real. He wasn't going back to his desk. He wasn't going to shake hands with his superiors and be assured that they'd take care of it. He wasn't going to walk away from this. The cuffs rattled as he was directed toward the vehicle, and in that moment, for the first time in his life, Darren truly understood what it meant to be powerless. Meanwhile, Malcolm remained at the top of the courthouse steps, the weight of the day pressing against him in a different way. He had won, not in the way Darren had assumed, not in a battle of egos, not in a game of who would outmaneuver who, but in the way that truly mattered. Justice had spoken. The system had not failed him this time. The truth had not been buried beneath bureaucracy and corruption. But there was no joy in it. No satisfaction in watching a man fall under the weight of his own arrogance. Malcolm knew better than anyone that justice wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about watching another man suffer. It was about accountability, about consequences, about ensuring that the world knew, no one was above the law, not even those who had spent their lives wielding it like a weapon. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him momentarily from the moment. A message from a colleague. The DA wants to move forward with full charges. They're not cutting him a deal. Looks like this one sticks. Malcolm exhaled, letting the words settle over him. This one sticks. For so many years, he had watched men like Darren walk away untouched, unscathed, free to continue their reign of unchecked authority. Not this time. He lifted his gaze just in time to see the transport van pull away, Darren's face barely visible through the small, reinforced window. Their eyes met for the briefest second before the vehicle turned the corner, disappearing from view. Malcolm let out a slow breath. The reckoning had come. And for once, justice had not looked away. The world outside the courthouse was still buzzing, the weight of the moment reverberating through the streets, through the media, through the stunned silence of those who had never thought they would see the day when one of their own was the one being led away in cuffs. The cameras had captured every second of Darren Callaway's downfall, from the stunned disbelief in his eyes to the sheer finality of the transport van's doors slamming shut behind him. It was everywhere now, on the news, in the papers, online. A viral moment. A reckoning. Inside the courthouse, Malcolm Hayes stood in his chambers, staring at his own reflection in the large window overlooking the city. His face was still marked from the blow Darren had delivered, a faint cut at the corner of his mouth, a bruise that would darken by the hour. But none of that mattered. This moment wasn't about pain. It wasn't about him. It was about something much bigger. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned, exhaling before answering. "Come in." The door creaked open, and District Attorney Vanessa Greer stepped inside, her expression unreadable. She was sharp, calculated, a woman who had spent years fighting the system from within, never allowing herself to get too hopeful, too trusting that justice would ever work the way it was supposed to. But today was different. She studied Malcolm for a moment before speaking. They're moving forward. No deals. No special considerations. Callaway is being processed, and the department isn't stepping in to protect him this time. Malcolm didn't react immediately, letting the weight of her words settle in. Then, slowly, he nodded. Good. Vanessa crossed her arms, watching him carefully. You don't look like a man who just won. Malcolm let out a short breath, shaking his head. Because this isn't a victory, Vanessa. It's justice. And justice isn't supposed to feel like a game where one side wins and the other loses. It's supposed to be the way things are. Vanessa studied him for a long moment before stepping further into the room, lowering her voice. You and I both know that's not how the system works, not usually. You should at least take a second to breathe, to acknowledge what just happened today. Callaway isn't walking away from this. That's not something that happens every day. Malcolm sighed, running a hand over his jaw. And that's the problem, isn't it? That this is so rare. That we've seen men like him get away with worse, over and over, because they knew the system would always protect them. Vanessa leaned against the edge of his desk, her expression thoughtful. Maybe. But today, the system didn't protect him. Because you didn't let it. Malcolm met her gaze, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. And how long do you think it'll last before they start finding ways to spin this, before they start calling it an overreaction, before they start whispering that I overstepped? Vanessa let out a low, knowing laugh, shaking her head. Oh, they'll try. They always do. But this? This is bigger than them now. This isn't something they can just sweep under the rug. She exhaled, her expression softening slightly. You did what needed to be done, Malcolm. And whether you want to call it a victory or not, it mattered. Malcolm was quiet for a long moment before finally nodding. I know. A silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. They had been here before, fighting different battles, pushing against the same broken system. But today had shifted something. Today, the system hadn't won. Today, justice had. Vanessa glanced at the clock on the wall before pushing off the desk. I need to get back downstairs. The press is eating this up, and I need to make sure the department doesn't start backpedaling. She paused at the door, glancing back at him. You should get some rest, Malcolm. Malcolm let out a short breath, nodding. I will. She didn't believe him. But she left anyway. He stood there for a long moment after she was gone, staring at the empty space where she had stood, at the door that had just closed behind her. Then, slowly, he turned back to the window, the city stretching before him, full of people who had watched today unfold, full of people who would remember. And somewhere out there, Darren Callaway was sitting in a cold cell, for the first time in his life without the shield of his badge to protect him. A sharp knock at the door pulled Malcolm from his thoughts again. He sighed, rolling his shoulders before answering. Come in. The door opened, and this time, it wasn't a colleague. It was Callaway's attorney. The man stepped inside, his face drawn, his posture tense. Malcolm's expression hardened. I assume you're not here to tell me your client has found a way out of this. The attorney let out a breath, shaking his head. No. He knows he's out of options. He asked for something. Something I told him I'd at least try to arrange. Malcolm crossed his arms. And what is that? The attorney hesitated for a beat before finally saying it. He wants to talk to you. Malcolm's jaw tightened, his chest constricting slightly at the unexpectedness of it. He wasn't sure what he had been expecting, but it wasn't that. The attorney continued, his voice low. Look, I don't know what he wants to say. I don't know if it's a waste of time. But I figured I'd at least pass the message along. Malcolm was silent for a long moment, the weight of the request pressing against him. Then, finally, he exhaled. Fine. Take me to him. The attorney gave a curt nod before stepping aside, leading Malcolm out of the chambers and down the quiet, dimly lit hallways. Every step felt heavier than the last, the tension curling in Malcolm's chest like something unspoken, unfinished. And as they approached the holding cells, as Darren Callaway sat on the other side of the bars, his hands resting on his lap, his face stripped of arrogance, of power, of certainty, Malcolm knew one thing for sure. This conversation was going to change everything. The holding cell smelled of cold metal, old sweat, and something faintly stale, like the lingering remnants of too many days spent in confinement. The dull fluorescent lights overhead cast sharp shadows against the concrete walls, washing everything in a sterile, lifeless hue. The low hum of officers moving in and out of the precinct filled the air, but in this small, confined space, there was only one thing that mattered, the conversation about to unfold. Darren Callaway sat on the bench inside the cell, his posture slouched, his hands resting loosely between his knees. He wasn't in uniform anymore. They had stripped him of it the moment he had been processed, replacing it with the standard inmate jumpsuit, a symbol that he was no longer the enforcer, but the one being judged. The weight of it sat heavy on his shoulders, pressing down harder than the walls that now confined him. When Malcolm Hayes stepped into view, the faintest trace of hesitation flickered in Darren's eyes. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something else, something unspoken, something that curled at the edges of his expression like a frayed thread waiting to unravel. He hadn't expected Malcolm to actually come. He had asked for this meeting, sure, but some part of him had assumed it would be denied, dismissed as a waste of time. Yet, here he was. Malcolm stood just beyond the bars, his face unreadable, his hands resting at his sides. The bruising at the corner of his mouth had darkened, a visual reminder of how all of this had started, of the moment Darren had thrown a punch without thinking, without hesitating, without ever considering that there would be real consequences. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then, Darren let out a slow breath, tilting his head slightly, his voice rough, as if it had taken him hours to find the words. "Didn't think you'd actually come." Malcolm didn't move, didn't blink. "I wasn't sure I would." Darren scoffed softly, shaking his head. "But you did." Malcolm exhaled, steady and measured. "I did." Another stretch of silence settled between them, thick and unyielding. Darren's fingers flexed against his knees before clenching into loose fists. He wasn't used to this, to having to explain himself, to having to answer for something, to being the one on the receiving end of scrutiny that couldn't be brushed off or ignored. He had spent his entire career looking at people from the other side of the bars, issuing orders, making arrests, dictating outcomes. But now, the roles had flipped, and he hated it, not just because of the humiliation, but because of the truth in it. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "So what happens now?" Malcolm's gaze was steady. "You tell me." Darren huffed out something that was supposed to be a laugh but came out hollow. "Come on, Judge. You don't really expect me to have an answer to that." Malcolm took a slow step closer. "I expect you to be honest." Darren let out another breath, heavier this time. His knee bounced slightly, a nervous tick he hadn't even realized was there. "Honest about what?" "That I fucked up. That I lost everything in a matter of seconds. That I spent my whole life believing I was in control, that I was untouchable, and now here I am, locked up like the people I used to arrest." His voice dropped lower, something raw bleeding into it. "Is that what you want to hear?" Malcolm studied him for a long moment before speaking. "I want to hear the truth. Not the version you've told yourself to survive. The truth." Darren's jaw tightened. He looked away, exhaling hard through his nose. "The truth," he muttered, shaking his head. "The truth is, I don't know who the hell I am without that badge." Malcolm remained silent, letting the words settle between them. Darren's hands tightened into fists again, his knuckles paling under the pressure. "I spent my whole damn life being told what it meant to be a man, to be a cop, to be in charge. My father was a cop. My grandfather was a cop. Hell, I didn't even think I had a choice. It wasn't just a job, it was a damn legacy. His voice grew tighter, more strained. And I lived by their rules. The rules they taught me. The rules they followed. The rules that said men like me didn't have to answer for shit because we were the ones making the rules. And I believed it. I believed it so hard that it never even crossed my mind that one day, one fucking day, those same rules wouldn't apply to me anymore. Malcolm let the confession linger in the air, heavy with years of unchecked power, of ingrained entitlement, of an entire system designed to protect men like Darren until they pushed too far. And Darren had pushed too far. Darren's breath hitched, his shoulders rising and falling with the weight of everything crashing down on him at once. And now? His voice was quieter now, almost defeated. Now, I don't know what the hell I am. Because if I'm not that guy, if I'm not the one in charge, then, what's left of me? Malcolm finally spoke, his tone steady, but firm. That's something only you can figure out. Darren let out a rough, humorless chuckle. Yeah. Well, seems like I'm gonna have a lot of time to think about it. Malcolm didn't argue. Didn't offer false sympathy. Instead, he leaned in just slightly, his gaze sharp, unyielding. And maybe that's exactly what you need. Darren's lips parted as if he wanted to fire back, to lash out, to find some way to flip the conversation back into something he could control. But there was nothing left. No badge. No authority. No power. Just truth. And for the first time, he had to sit with it. Malcolm straightened, stepping back. You wanted this meeting. So tell me, Callaway, why am I here? Darren swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His throat felt tight, his pulse thrumming in his ears. He didn't know why he had asked for this. Maybe he had thought he could find a way to justify himself, to make Malcolm see something different. Or maybe, deep down, he had just needed to look the man he had wronged in the eye and acknowledge what he had done. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. I don't know. Malcolm nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. As if he already knew. Then, he turned, stepping away from the bars, his hands tucking into his pockets. Darren watched him go, watched as the only man in that courtroom who had truly seen through him, who had held him accountable, who had refused to let him walk away unscathed, disappeared down the corridor, leaving him alone with nothing but the four walls of his cell and the truth he had spent his whole life running from. And for the first time in his life, Darren Callaway was truly alone. The courtroom was long behind him, but the weight of it still lingered in Malcolm Hayes' chest. The events of the past days had unraveled with an intensity that felt surreal, yet every moment had been precise, deliberate, leading exactly to where they were now. Justice had been served, not just in the technical sense of legal proceedings, but in the deeper, undeniable way that felt different this time. For once, the system hadn't swallowed the truth whole. It hadn't buried it beneath bureaucracy, behind false reports, beneath the weight of whispered conversations between powerful men in closed-door meetings. This time, it had done what it was meant to do. Darren Callaway was no longer an officer of the law. His badge had been stripped, his pension revoked, his name a stain on the department that had once protected him. The trial had moved swiftly after that day in court, his violent outburst serving as undeniable proof of the kind of man he was, the kind of man who had operated with unchecked power for far too long. The footage of him striking a judge in open court had circulated everywhere, his name becoming synonymous with the very corruption and abuse of power he had spent his life denying existed. There had been no deals, no lifeline, no escape. In the end, the same system that had shielded him for years had turned its back on him the second he became a liability. He had been sentenced to prison, not for decades, but long enough for it to matter. Long enough for him to feel the cold, inescapable truth that the world had moved on without him. In the days following the verdict, Malcolm had watched the reactions unfold in waves, some celebrating, others skeptical, some questioning whether one conviction was enough, whether this moment would lead to real change or whether it was just another exception in a system designed to protect men like Darren. The conversations were loud, heated, filled with people grasping at their own interpretations of justice. But Malcolm knew one thing: change wasn't a single moment. It was the accumulation of moments, of fights, of battles won and lost, of voices that refused to be silenced. And Malcolm Hayes had no intention of being silent. The afternoon air was crisp as he stepped outside, the courthouse behind him standing tall against the city skyline. Vanessa Greer was waiting near the bottom of the steps, arms crossed, her expression unreadable as he approached. She exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "You really made history with this one, you know that?" Malcolm let out a small breath, neither quite a laugh nor a sigh. "I don't care about history. I care about what comes next." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "So do I." They walked together toward the street, the sounds of the city humming around them. There was no grand victory parade, no overwhelming sense of finality, just the quiet, steady realization that there was still work to be done. The world had seen what happened. But what mattered now was whether it remembered. Across town, Darren Callaway sat in the dimly lit confines of his new reality. Prison wasn't just about confinement, it was about irrelevance. He was no longer the man people feared. No longer the voice of authority. No longer anything but another inmate in a place filled with men whose lives had been dictated by the very system he once enforced. Some of them recognized him. Some of them remembered the things he had done, the ways he had wielded his power against them. And Darren knew, he wasn't going to be protected here. His first days had been the hardest. The silence. The loss of control. The realization that no one was coming to save him. He had been discarded, left to rot in the very place he had sent so many others. And the worst part? For the first time, he understood what it felt like to be powerless. In the weeks that followed, he stopped trying to convince himself that there had been a way out, that he had been the victim of some overreach of justice. The truth was raw, undeniable. He had done this to himself. And now, all he had left was time to sit with the truth, to let it weigh on him, to recognize that for all the years he had spent believing himself untouchable, he had never truly been free. Malcolm didn't think about Darren much after that. There was nothing left to think about. The past had been reckoned with, and the future belonged to those willing to fight for it. And Malcolm? He had never been more ready. Justice wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about watching someone fall. It was about ensuring that the world understood the cost of corruption, of unchecked power, of silence in the face of wrongdoing. And as Malcolm walked away from the courthouse that day, he knew, this wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. Now, let me ask you something. How many times have we seen injustice and thought, that's just the way things are? How many times have we accepted that power protects itself, that some people will always walk away untouched while others bear the weight of a system built against them? This story isn't just about one man's fall. It's about the shift that happens when people refuse to accept that the system can't be challenged. It's about accountability, about standing up even when it seems impossible. So tell me, what did this story make you feel? Did it make you angry? Did it make you think? More importantly, did it make you believe that change is possible? Because if it did, then you already know the next step. You speak up. You don't look away. You make sure that justice isn't an exception, it's the rule. And if you want more stories that make you think, that make you question, that keep you on the edge of your seat, then make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because we don't just tell stories, we reveal the truth. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.